Hello, my name is Mike, and I am going to be your host for the first of what I hope is many commentaries. Uh, Before we get into the movie Dracula, I think it'd be best to introduce myself as, you never met me before, but I am a huge monster kid, and I can't think of any better film to start off this experiment than Dracula, starring my personal idol, Bela Lugosi. This is a film I've admired very much, and just for Lugosi himself, his sure acting, and I hope you'll enjoy it too. I am paused right on the first note of Swan Lake, and the edition that we are watching is Universal's new Monster Collection Blu-ray edition. I am paused right now, and I'm going to start the track in 3 seconds. 1, 2, and 3. Right now, we should be seeing Carl Laemmle presents Dracula, and that great image of the bat over there. And Swan Lake is playing, and I can't think of a better way to start this off. It's not the type of music you think automatically would go with this. In fact, it was used in a few Universal movies after this, but I think it is just synonymous with Dracula. It's a haunting piece of music, and it's kind of ingrained in my head, like Pavlov dog, as Dracula, the players, Bela Lugosi, Count Dracula, Mina, Helen Chandler, John Harker, David Manners, and Renfield Dwight Frye, who I think almost steals this movie just as much as Lugosi does. Right now, we are just about to begin. I think I misread the credits. I was waiting for Browning to introduce him, but the film is directed by Todd Browning, and he's not really who you would think of when you see Dracula and compare it to his other work. Of course, he was famous in making, I believe, 10 or 11 films with Lon Chaney in the 20s, and many say that they are the predecessor to Dracula, but I really do not think that is true. Chaney was more of a melodramatic actor, and his characters were about melodramas, and I think it's really unfair to compare Dracula to those early works, and Browning in particular, because this isn't a typical Browning film. Dracula deserves a great deal of credit because this is the first horror film, well, the first horror film made in America, I believe. Uh, Before this, during Chaney's time and in the 20s, there weren't a direct supernatural threat. Every sort of horror had to be explained off as an oddity or, illusion. More on that later. Right now, we are entering the hotel the where the peasants are warning Dwight Frye's Renfield about the Castle Dracula. And I love this scene in particular because of Michael Visseroff here. He's kind of this fat Slav that wasn't really nice, but he's kind of this guy that he's definitely Browning's good luck charm because he appears in 3 of Browning's best sound pictures, and he isn't anywhere better than here. That mustache is incredible. He actually, from what I've heard, he played Joseph Stalin in some propaganda films, and he's perfect. But he really goes over the top here. I love his eyebrows. The Castle Dracula, you know, I'm sure he was one of the biggest inspirations for Mel Brooks or when they make fun of these films. But he is great here, and he pretty much plays the same role in every Browning film as the kind of superstitious uh, guy who believes in these monsters. Fry here is playing Renfield, and he is utterly fantastic in this movie. And right now, he is kind of going against what we know him as. He's sane here, and this is one of the major deviations from any version of Dracula that came before this. Renfield is taking the place of Jonathan Harker, who in the novel is actually the one that goes to Dracula's castle and meets the peasants and is there to sell Dracula his new estate in London. But in this version, Frye's Renfield is there, and I think this is actually somewhat of an improvement over the source material in terms of adapting it, because although it weakens the character Jonathan Harker later on, which we'll discuss, but I think it makes sense that you use this character of Renfield, who goes utterly mad by his interaction with the Count, and it makes sense that he is the one that there's a or method to his madness, so to say. In the novel, Renfield, and somewhat in the film, he doesn't really do anything. There's not really an arc to his character all that much. He's sort of like this responder to the evil of Dracula. He senses it. And here, there's something tragic about the character, that he was sane and he just becomes this dog that loses his free will. Right now, we're about to be introduced to Lugosi's Dracula. Karl Freund's camera is moving slowly into the coffin, and here comes his hand. And I gotta say, if using your whole body, Lugosi probably used his hand better than any actor I've ever seen. I know in Ed Wood, which is a great movie, they make a joke about how Lugosi, his hand, you must be double jointed in Hungarian, but I digress. Here he is. We're sinking deeper and deeper into his eyes, and just to imagine what it would be like in 1931 seeing it for the first time, it must have been utterly petrifying. And this is where Karl Freund's cinematography really, really outshines itself. Freund is who I would like to call the director of this film, even over Browning, because I think there's a distinct style. This feels like an old-fashioned German expressionist film taken out of Germany and moved into Hollywood. Freund, of course, was trained by F.W. Murnau, who made probably the most famous of vampire films. I'd even argue that it's better than Dracula, although I do love Dracula. I probably prefer it. But Nosferatu is what started the vampire film. And it has, like all German expressionist film, this great dreamlike quality to the shots. And Freund is able to mimic that quite well here, especially like right now when we're looking into Lugosi's eyes. The camera doesn't move very much in Dracula, aside from this first 20 minutes or so when Renfield meets the Count and we see the origin of the whole story, getting him to London. But there are some wonderful still shots, and they all have to do with Lugosi. They're lighted beautifully, looking directly into his eyes. Here we come to the castle, and I don't want to claim this fact as my own. I believe I heard it somewhere, but I think this was somewhere I've heard that this was filmed on the Psycho Hill at Universal Studios. I don't know for sure, but it would definitely be cool if it were true. And Dracula's bat floating over the horses. Like, this is the closest it comes to the Stoker novel, and unsurprisingly, this is the best part of the film. There's, like, right out of Stoker. Here we come to Renfield at the castle walls, and I gotta say, it doesn't get any better than this. This is about the finest 5 minutes of film, Lugosi's introduction. his booming voice, and there's such a build-up here. I I mean, it hasn't lost a beat even after being almost 100 years old. And I've seen it so many times over the years, and it still is fresh. The castle's an awkward-looking structure, but it's so huge and imposing, and there's all those critters moving around, even though that, you won't find, what's it, a possum in Transylvania, I doubt it, and the bats on strings. But there's a beauty to it, really. All the shadows. This is horror at its finest, gothic horror, and everything is a pale imitation, in my opinion. Well, no, but here he comes, Count Dracula. I am Dracula. Oh, it sucks the air out of the room. It really does. And Lugosi, I, you know, he is a tragedy in a lot of ways. There were a lot of lows in his career, certainly. But what people fail to do is to look at the highs. And I don't think there's a greater high that an actor has had than this. Roger Ebert wrote in his great films review of Dracula that Lugosi, he speaks his lines almost phonetically, and that is a popular urban legend about the film, that Lugosi didn't know English at the time when it was filmed. And of course, that's utter nonsense. He had been in the country about 10, 12 years before Dracula came out, and he knew pretty much every bit of English he would know by this point. But there's a certain charm to the rumor, and I think you could actually say that the way Dracula speaks to Renfield, the line by line, the deliberateness, he doesn't speak English in any way that any person would do. He's very alien. And Roger Ebert wrote that he comes to English sideways, as someone who's been cooped up in his castle, void of human interaction, that he's never had a chance to actually speak with anyone. And I love that. I think it describes it perfectly. The life, Mr. Renfield. Renfield already regrets coming in. The look on Frye's face is priceless. Why, yes. This is a good moment, too, when Dracula plays host. And it is very nice. Like, there's always something that I always liked about this part in any adaptation of Dracula. Of course, it's probably the most memorable here, because of course Lugosi offers him some fine wine. But, there's something very interesting about it, and I think it goes into the dynamic about how the vampire is not human. That he hasn't been human in so long that the whole concept of doing something so trivial as, feeding someone wine or, setting up a fire is kind of lost on them because they aren't human. They have been cooped away from civilization. They don't speak in a normal conversation. They just have this bloodlust. And it was done, there's a brilliant parody of this idea in Shadow of the Vampire, which is a great film I would recommend just for anyone who's into classic horror. But Willem Dafoe plays this cooked out version of Max Schreck, who has one of the best horror monologues about this. Lugosi is probably the most famous Dracula. And I would even say that he's had more influence on the character than even Bram Stoker himself did. In Lugosi, you have the prototype of this sexual vampire. Of course, that's in the Stoker novel too, but it's in more of a negative way. Like that vampirism is this metaphor for Victorian sexual perversion and disease. But with Lugosi, he's suave. You want to be him, even though you know it's self-destructive and haunting. Lugosi, unfortunately, I think, along with all the positive things he's done for the role and just how brilliant he is here, he is the origin of the idea that the vampires can be sexy and that, they kind of lose their edge when you go too much into it. You have to have this tragedy of being a vampire that you don't want to be it. It is a curse. And I think here's a moment where you particularly see it when Dracula sees Renfield pricking his finger, and he just loses it, stalking in, taking deliberate steps towards it. This whole charade of being human, it can only go so far. Here comes probably my favorite moment. It's just Lugosi so perfectly enunciating his dialogue, offering Renfield some wine. Very old wine. I hope you will like it. And I love, Frye doesn't get enough credit, I don't think, for creating this character in the first portion of the film, when Renfield still has all his marbles. He, like, in the Stoker novel, Harker goes through this sacrifice, even though he knows that this Dracula might not be on level, because he sees this as an opportunity to advance himself. And Frye kind of has this great naivete that, although I don't know if that's what their intention was, Browning's intention, that it just kind of, it shows through that Renfield is this kind of bright-eyed business guy who wants to make a fortune for himself, and now he's realizing how wrong he was and not heeding the warnings of the peasants who know what was really up. This film was directed by Todd Browning, who earlier did London After Midnight, which in many ways I think could be considered the prototype for Dracula. I remember reading somewhere that Browning initially wanted to do Dracula back then, but the rights, of course, were very hard to get. Nosferatu could not be filmed initially. Florence Stoker, Bram Stoker's widow, refused for the rights to be given. And this is the first official approved version of Dracula. And what you'll find out is that it is not the Stoker novel that is being filmed here. It is an adaptation of the Hamilton Dean stage play, which, if you haven't seen it or read it, it is a far less ambitious version of the story. This beginning is the best part of the film because I feel that it's the farthest from the stage play. Dracula is hovering over Renfield, and he's about to turn him into his slave. Right now we are on the Vista, bound for England. And this was a sequence lifted directly from the Stoker novel, and it is haunting in every version, particularly Nosferatu. In this version, it's a little awkward, but it still works because we have Renfield here, who has by now taken a 360-degree turn to madness. And here comes Lugosi rising from the casket. This is kind of an awkward situation because this is obviously stock footage from a silent film. Sure I've heard which one it was before, but it really kind of stands out because the frame rate of the silent film transfixed with this slow, deliberate look at Lugosi over Renfield is kind of awkward, but it's still just a very powerful motif, I believe. I wish it was done a little bit better here. Lugosi's moving up to the crew who don't really know what's going on. It's really kind of silly looking, but of course Lugosi isn't. I've heard rumors that they were going to make a film just based off of the Vista. Right now, we're going to hear Todd Browning's voice. I believe he is the one. I heard that he was the one doing this and saying that the captain is dead, tied to the wheel. Poor Dwight Frye. You can't. You feel sorry for Lugosi, but at least Lugosi was viewed as something of a star. Poor Dwight Frye was even second fiddle to Lugosi, and from what I've heard, he had a pretty successful career as a Broadway actor. I don't know if he originated the role of Renfield on the stage, but he definitely did get typecasted, probably worse than any other horror actor, in that he was never the main monster. He always played second fiddle to a Boris Karloff or a Bela Lugosi, and by the end of his career, he was in movies like The Ghost of Frankenstein and Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. He didn't even have any interaction with the monsters. He was just kind of the guy who stood to the side and would light the torches, I guess, to ransack the castles. But he is fantastic here, and he actually picks up a lot of the burden, moves the film along in a lot of ways, because once Lugosi kind of leaves the picture, and when the movie becomes more about the vampire hunters and the vampire, they're sadly pretty dull. Edward Van Sloan leaves a lot to be desired as a Van Helsing, but when you have Dwight Frye screaming out as Renfield, the picture gets its pulse back. Now, this is beautiful. Lugosi moving through the streets of London, haunting his prey with fresh necks. And that really, I think, must have been this scene here where Lugosi attacks the flower girl, must have been the first indication that America now had a horror genre, and that this was a supernatural monster, and it must have been extremely shocking. Frankenstein even more so, but I've heard stories about people fainting during the first showings of Dracula when it initially came out in 1931. And of course, religious groups were in an uproar about this idea that there was something beyond the grave that, frankly, was pretty blasphemous. And of course, down the road, the horror got progressively, took more risks. And eventually, there was a big factor in creating the Hays Code, which kind of gutted horror films for a long time. But this was the first horror film. What I didn't mention earlier was that this is from the Universal under the Laemmle regime, who founded the Universal Pictures. Carl Laemmle was the founder, and Carl Jr. is who we really have to thank for there even being the Universal Monsters, for there even being a Bela Lugosi or a Boris Karloff or a Lon Chaney Jr., because he loved horror, and he was the one who encouraged his father, who, from what I've heard, hated horror films, to do Dracula in the first place. And a big, initially, I believe I heard that they wanted to do something a little closer to the Stoker novel, but the Great Depression came, and they had to go for the less ambitious version of the story, which was actually the Hamilton Dean play, which I think we will need to go into to understand and sort of appreciate this film. The Hamilton Dean play is what I would call a sitting room drama, and it's very much in the continuities of time, space, and place in theater. Uh, the whole thing takes place at Seward's Sanitarium, and pretty much the entire war, or I don't know if you call it a war, but the entire conflict with Dracula takes place in this living room, and it presents some interesting challenges. I think it's a good piece. I think it's done. If it's done right, it's a pretty good piece of theater, and of course, it is what brought Lugosi to the attention of everyone. Lugosi had been I don't know if he was the one who originated it. I'm sure I'd remember that, but he was the one who was most famous, and he did portray it the most. And I know he eventually did do it on Broadway, along with Edward Van Sloan and Herbert Bunston here, who plays Dr. Seward. But Lugosi, before Dracula, he wasn't a complete unknown, contrary to belief. A good book to check out, which I think gives you pretty much everything you would want to know about Lugosi. It's out of print, but it's a really good find if you could get a copy of it, is The Man Behind the Cape. And I was interested in Lugosi before any of this, to see where he came from. And like I probably mentioned earlier, he had been in the States about 10, 12 years, and he learned English through the theater, like people kind of misinterpreted. But of course, he was this exotic European, and from what I heard, he was typecasted in like the role of exotics as romantic foreigners, and that was what made Dracula, or at least this interpretation of Dracula, pretty revolutionary, because he wasn't this ugly creature from Stoker. He wasn't a Max Schreck. This Dracula in Hamilton Dean play, he has to pretend that he is normal and that he does want to have a place in society. And it's interesting because the character had never been done like that before, and it adds a certain dimension. I don't know how well it works in the long run, because you can't really do a whole lot of supernatural technique in that, because you're trapped by the limitations of theater, and unfortunately the film is kind of very faithful to the book, to the play, and that we do see the, like kind of the traps, the bats on strings, the fog. And like I said, there's a certain charm to it, and I think we're in competent hands in that Freud films it and stages it pretty well for the most part. But it doesn't work all the time, unfortunately. Dracula isn't in the play all that often, actually. And he's not really in the film all that often now that we have gotten to England. Dracula, if you read the novel and here, is more of a story about the vampire hunters than the vampire himself. And one improvement I think that the play offers is that, there is more to do with Dracula, is that he doesn't disappear. But once the facade is lifted and you find out he's a vampire, he does. So what we have now is that the hunters really have to step up their game and be tremendously interesting in order to, draw our attention away from the fact that the most charismatic person isn't on screen, Bela Lugosi. And we're about to be introduced to our hunter, Edward von Sloan, who gets a pretty thankless job in all the Universal films he's in. He's pretty much here only to deliver exposition. And, it's a tough role to do. I really think it's an interesting role if it's done right. But pretty much everyone that plays Van Helsing has to over and over again explain the tropes of the vampire, how he is killed, garlic, silver bullets. Well, not silver bullets, but he has to protect the woman. It's a pretty dead end character, and you really need an actor who's very committed to give it life. And I think Edward von Sloan can be entertaining. He's very, very good in Frankenstein, I believe, because he has a Colin Clive who isn't completely dead in interacting with him, that has a little life and has some spunk and doesn't just take the warnings with a grain of salt. But in Dracula, you don't really have that. Herbert Bunston is completely lifeless and just, takes in Sloane's exposition like a sponge. And to be fair, Sloane does play it like an academic, but he's not this eccentric that I think you expect from a Van Helsing. He's very much just as is. Here we have Dwight Frye and Martin going over their spiders. Martin is actually in the Hamilton Dean version of the play, and he, believe it or not, from the version I've read, the dialogue with that thick Cockney accent is actually in the play, written. It's abbreviated and stuff, so you can't read the dialogue as is. You have to get that thick accent, and it's a trap for the play. I imagine any director wanting to do it would really have to look at how to do that without generating tremendous laughs, because he really makes it hard to take the whole thing seriously. But I think it's done pretty well in the film, to tell you the truth. I mean, Charles Gerard plays him here, Martin. And in the play, he's called Butterworth. I don't even think he's named in the play. He's called Attendant. But, I think the character can be done well. He's kind of cute, and that you do need some brevity from this. And certainly in this film, in 1931, when something like this had never been seen before, I'm sure audiences liked the character. He has a pretty good line coming up later on. Van Helsing here. Thank God for Peter Cushing. That is one improvement over the original, if you want to say that, because Peter Cushing has an urgency in delivering this that Van Sloan doesn't really have. And that generally, I think, is the problem with Dracula, is that there is a complete lack of urgency here. The film takes time to, stop dead in its tracks and have Van Sloan slowly go through all the pieces of the vampire myth. Here is the introduction of the Wolfbane, which I like. It's used in the play. It's not really used in any other version of the story, but I like that, that there's more to... It's more believable than garlic, that it actually grows in Transylvania and it's exotic. unlike garlic. Here we go with Renfield, concerned about his soul. And I think when the character of Renfield is done right, that is the most interesting thing about him. And Renfield in this film, I think I think there was some bits cut out where he acts on his animal urges that isn't seen, or that was cut out. Like there's a scene where he attacks a maid and we get to see more of it. And so Fry, even though he's so damn good in the role, the character doesn't really have an arc. He just kind of goes mad and goes tragic. But I think this, well, while it truly doesn't have an arc, the whole idea of him being concerned about his soul and going to hell and being judged because he is the servant of the vampire really, I think, gives him gravitas. He makes him tragic in that, there is a concern, and that this idea that Dracula can give him eternal life, but what cost would that be? And that's really the quintessential debate about vampirism. Like, if you could live forever, would it be worth it to go through this curse? And Fry definitely is cursed. He definitely is the idea that being a vampire isn't fun, contrary to what Anne Rice would have you believe, or any of those Twilight people. But we won't mention them again. Renfield is talking about Miss Mina, and she can be a thankless character, but I think um, I don't think she's really been done all that well. I feel that above anything else, this might be the greatest trap of the Hamilton Dean play, and maybe not of this film, but of the Dracula story in general, is that Mina is sort of seen as this object that Dracula and Van Helsing and Harker are fighting over. And I think if you want to add something more to the story, that you really have to beef up Mina. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, I know a lot of people hate that film, but I think its heart is in the right place in what it does to Mina and how it makes some improvements on the character, and that she is sort of tempted by Dracula, and that she could make a choice for herself, choosing between Dracula and Harker and the heroes. Here's the bat on the string, and here is Dracula, and this is the most controversial shot in the movie. They actually left a cardboard piece over that lamp there. It's a blooper that I can't believe's in it, and it's really fun when you see it. Lugosi, this must have been just utterly scary. I mean, you don't really. I think a big part of looking at this movie is looking at the context of what it meant to someone in 1931. And like I said earlier, there was anything like this. And just the idea of Lugosi moving in on a woman's neck, that must have been the most blatantly sexual idea, or, just scene that had ever been done before. I mean, even beyond the whole idea of blasphemy and The Walking Dead and this undead creature that couldn't be explained by anything rational, just the idea of sex, and that is kind of what Dracula is all about, and that is the appeal of it. Here is Jonathan Harker, and we're getting to know him. I don't even believe he's called Jonathan this. I think he's just John. But he's played by David Manners, who he's kind of the good luck charm of these Universal films like Van Sloan. I think he's in every one Van Sloan's in, aside from Frankenstein, but he is really utterly worthless. He has no chemistry with any of his leading ladies, and I believe he was gay, but that might explain him. But he was just in it because he was handsome, and I mean, there's an interview of him from of all times when he lived to be 98 years old, and he claimed that he never saw Dracula or the Mummy or the Black Cat or any of these films that he was in. And from what I've read a few of the interviews. He seems like a nice enough guy, but I mean, he is just so bland as a leading man here. And I think at the price of strengthening Renfield's character, that Jonathan Harker really suffers in this. Because in the book, Harker was given a little more character because he knew what Dracula was. But in this film, Harker doesn't know what Dracula was. And so the whole movie is really just Van Helsing trying to convince him that Dracula exists. And I mean, how many times can you play that same note? And Manners does play the same note over and over again. Right now, we have the meeting of Dracula and Van Helsing. And for what I said about Sloan earlier, kind of going through the film, just giving exposition, his scenes with Lugosi are fantastic. And I don't think the film, or Lugosi's performance, I think, is strengthened by Van Sloan. Because they really play off each other well, in that part of what Van Helsing sees in Dracula is an intellectual challenge, and that, this idea of vampirism and Lucy and Mina getting sick, there's no explanation to it. And so Van Helsing looks for the unknown, and he finds, I mean, to his horror, but also, I think if you were to play it right, maybe to his pleasure, or I don't know about pleasure, but to his pleasant surprise, that he has discovered this odd, unknown territory that only he was clever enough to see, but that he doesn't even fully comprehend the danger of. Right now, we're about to see the scene where Van Helsing confronts Lugosi with the mirror, because, of course, vampires cast no reflection in the light, in the mirror. And that's one of the tropes I've always really liked about vampire films, or just the vampire legend. And you can tell how serious a vampire film is by whether or not they follow the mirror, because I think that's the most important trope, but it is also the one that gets ignored the most. In Son of Dracula and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, the other two entries in this Dracula series, they blatantly show Dracula in the mirror. Things so incredible, I mistrust my own judgment. Look. That is just incredible. I mean, Lugosi, he doesn't actually get a whole lot of dialogue in this film. And of course, I think he's brilliant with what he does with the dialogue, but he is a very physical actor. And just that look of sheer anger when Van Helsing shows the mirror to him is just incredible. And Harker has a line right now where he compares him to a wild animal. It's so utterly true. Oh, this is my favorite line here. For one who has not lived even a single lifetime, you are a wise man, Van Helsing. Here is the most blatant example of following the stage. Harker rushes to the window and says, "Look, a wolf on the lawn." Of course, they can't show it. They couldn't show it in the actual adaptation of the play, and they're a little too literal in doing it. It was kind of unnecessary. But generally, that's... Dracula is our vampire. That's kind of interesting too, in that they go through a few possibilities about who the vampire might be, and you kind of take for granted the fact that these characters don't know who Dracula was, and the whole fact of confirming that he is the vampire is an important part of the story. And it's an important part in the book too, because for a long time Van Helsing and Seward and Quincy Morris and all of the heroes do not know who the vampire is, and the two stories kind of intersect. This is a beautiful shot here with the use of the shadows, and that is the defining thing about this film. For a lot of it, it is plays like just a regular stage play. But I think where Freud rightly gets praised is his use of lighting, which is utterly incredible. And for any fan out there who is debating whether or not to, upgrade their copy to the newest Blu-ray edition, I gotta say, go for it. Dracula has never looked this good. And I've owned every edition of this movie that Universal has put out, and it's like seeing the movie for the first time. Dracula aged probably the worst of any of the old Universal films. It really, sound-wise, was probably the worst. Like you could hear the cracks, and it got to the point where actually it would affect the dialogue. But now, it looks exactly like it must have did on a pristine screen in 1931. Here we have Renfield again, walking in seemingly out of nowhere, warning them, and the master is at hand. This is one of my great moments of the movie, because you know Renfield knows what is going on with Dracula, and yet he overreacts and expects you to say, "Oh, I never even heard the name before." Fry is accused of going over the top, and I like to give him the benefit of the doubt, but there's no excuse there. Out there, dead. This was the moment I was alluding to earlier, where it is completely cut out of the movie. The implication here is that Renfield is about to do something horrible to this maid. I I think it's really awkward. I mean, it especially must have been awkward back then because this looks like it's about to be a full-on rape. Um, I think now don't quote me as being an expert on this, but I think it's resolved a little bit. Well, you get to see more in the Spanish edition of Dracula, which some people say is better. I think it's a much more fluid film. You get to see, I think it has that sense of urgency a little bit better than this film does, but I don't think there's any contest over which version of the movie is better. The Spanish version does not have Bela Lugosi, and you know I don't care how much more competently it was filmed, how much more camera movement it had, how much urgency you're supposedly had. I'm willing to forgive pretty much all the faults of this movie for how strong Lugosi is in it. Here we have the resolution of the Lady in White, who of course is Lucy as a vampire. Uh, it was it. I think this is another example of where they could have been braver in resolving this and realizing that, hey, we are doing a movie. We are not doing a play. We're not just shooting a play. Um, we I don't think we ever get to see Lucy as a vampire other than that shot when she's walking. But it does follow the play in that Lucy, I don't think, is even a character in it. She isn't even on the stage. The whole movie, whole play, the action of the play begins with Van Helsing coming in to save Mina, who has the same symptoms of Lucy. For all this talk about the play, um, Universal, I believe, did want to do a more faithful adaptation of the Stoker novel. And the Depression happened. And so this was the more logical choice. But there is a great what if they had that big budget version of Dracula that would have that epic quality. And, there's consistent rumor about this movie is that had he not died, Lon Chaney was Universal's first choice to do the role of the Count. And, just knowing what I do about kind of what Chaney was doing at the time, first of all, he was with MGM, and MGM was a much more lucrative company than Universal at this time, and Lon Chaney was probably far too big a star to lend out to Universal for production like Dracula. And I think really his talents would have been wasted here. This is kind of a sitting room drama. And, people would expect that London after midnight, fangs and elaborate makeup. And would Lon Chaney look good in this movie? I really don't think so. He wouldn't have created an elaborate makeup. And if you've seen his one sound film, The Unholy Three, his voice is very American. I think what is really revolutionary about Lugosi is that this is the first attempt at changing what was thought of as a monster. There's Lugosi himself didn't even, I don't think they'd ever entered his mind when he did Dracula that this would cement him as a horror star, and that he would be forced to play the kind of grotesques that he was. Lugosi, and even Universal's own production or publicity, department thought of Dracula as kind of this really far out there exotic love story. And it was marketed, I believe the tagline was the strangest passion the world has ever known. And I think that is what drew Lugosi to the character. And that is what he would often say that he wanted to play. That he wanted to play this exotic, like, that was part of what he enjoyed more than the horror was playing these handsome figures. And, for a time, Lugosi, it was a brief time between Dracula and Frankenstein. Lugosi was kind of this, I think Dracula got it in his head that he was this sex symbol. And, of course, his famous, um, um, I've lost my train of thought, I apologize. His famous turning down the role of Frankenstein, I think, was because he didn't understand what Dracula was and what Dracula had done to him. He thought now he had this great opportunity to be this great lover, this kind of Rudolph Valentino with a very mysterious and kind of macabre edge. And instead, he finds himself playing monsters. And it's unfortunate. I think it was a grave miscalculation on his part. And, of course, he would never say no to anything again. I don't know for sure. You can't quote me as a historian on it. But I believe that his turning down Frankenstein was the reason that you see him in terrible, terrible movies like Vampire Over London, and is, in my opinion, the worst. And if you've never seen it, and you just want something that is so utterly horrendous, then that is the one to go, even over the Ed Wood pictures, in my opinion. But Lugosi, this wasn't the last time he would play the part. Of course, it is known that he, played various vampire-like characters in other movies, and he would play Dracula again in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. But I think what is, forgotten, and maybe not even forgotten, but not known, is that Lugosi played the role of Dracula on stage again and again and again. He played it even to the point where he was a little too old to play it. I think he played it even at the age of 72 in London, and there's definitely this is definitely the case of where actor is so associated with a role that it just becomes a horrible curse, but also a blessing at the same time. I love Lugosi as Dracula. And even with the knowledge that it tormented him, that he couldn't really express himself as fully as an actor as what he wanted. But this is a wonderful high point in a great career. And, it did offer him some opportunities that I think he really shines in. He isn't this one note character playing Dracula over and over again. He is brilliant in Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is his follow-up to Dracula. He plays this mad Darwinian scientist who's a wild man. And I think Lugosi's second best film after Dracula's The Black Cat, where he actually plays a hero to Boris Karloff's mad satanic doctor. Lugosi plays this wounded World War II hero who wants revenge. It plays like the most macabre kind of modern day melodramatic tragedies. Here, Lugosi is confronting Van Helsing, and this, like I said earlier, is really what makes Van Sloan's performance stand out, because come here. Come here. Oh, I'm sorry, this is a great scene. Lugosi was actually the lowest paid of the um, principal cast of Dracula. And without him, it's, even if he hadn't been cast, there's probably a good chance the movie wouldn't have been made at all, because in addition to playing Dracula, Lugosi actually helped get the rights from Florence Stoker. He wrote to Florence Stoker, lobbying for her to say that this will be a grand production. And I think, unfortunately, as what happens in show business sometimes, that Universal saw how desperate Lugosi was to get the part, and that they said, hey, here's a guy we can take advantage of. Here's a guy that we can lowball. And instead of looking, I guess they were looking at some big stars. One in particular interest I've heard, I don't know if it's true or not, but they were looking at Paul Muni, who was marketed as the next Lon Chaney. I think that was his tagline for a little bit, and he's brilliant in Scarface, and I think he would have been good here, but Lugosi got $500, I think, in total or a week for being in this film. And, for just the amount of how much this film has done for Universal and what it meant for Lugosi, I mean, it really is just unfortunate. And it wasn't the first time that Lugosi was taken advantage of in such ways. When horror films were outlawed in Great Britain following the 1935 or so, they actually did a law just plain outright banning horror films. And so Universal said, what do we need Lugosi for? And so they just didn't work for 4 years until by chance there was a revival of these old films and they became popular again, and there was a demand for sequels or reinventions. And so Lugosi came back with Son of Frankenstein, and then they said, oh, he'll be so desperate that he'll take whatever we could give him. And that generally became the whole story of Lugosi's life, unfortunately. And, there were a few cases where he should have said, no, this is beneath me. And yet, a lot of times you look at Lugosi's film as a fan and say, it's really too bad. But I think that there's a lot to admire about Lugosi. And even in a bad film, even especially in a bad movie, because unlike some actors in a bad movie who realize that they are in a bad movie and they just kind of, phone it in. Lugosi treats every performance, even in bad films, like he does in Dracula. There's a real goofy movie called The Devil Bad, where if you are a fan of bad movies in any way, I really highly recommend it. It's really hard to get a good print of it because it's in public domain, and so any bozo can, put it in a dollar store bin. But Lugosi plays this chemist who makes aftershave of all things, and so to get revenge on all the people in the cologne business, he creates this mutant bat that is attracted to the scent of the aftershave that he patents. And so he gets revenge on all of them by having this goofy bat on a string kill everybody. And you know what? Lugosi treats it like it's Hamlet. It's utterly entertaining. I really highly recommend it. It's the kind of movie you would hope for when you look at the Ed Wood movies, which in my opinion are pretty boring. Right now, we're about to enter the climax of the movie, and the movie kind of implodes on itself in some ways because they realize here uh, Harker finally gets to his senses and realizes that Dracula is real and that everything Van Helsing has said is true. And then they just sort of go to the room and talk and see Renfield come out of seemingly nowhere and lead them to the castle. I think one of the ways that the play is actually stronger, where I think could have been done better here, is that they actually use Renfield as sort of they kind of bait him into going after Dracula. Here we have Martin shooting at Dracula, and there's a great line in the play that they don't use in here, where they shoot at the bat and they say, "Oh, it can't hurt that," and then Van Helsing says, "My weapons are stronger," and I really love that line. Of course, being about the crucifixes and holy wafers. Dracula is right now they're about to enter in the climax of the movie. Dracula is calling Mina to come to him, and he never really makes good on any of his promises, saying, "Oh, I'll get away, I'll hide my earth boxes." He is in the same place that he was in before. And so the movie doesn't really have a very good, cause and effect, this. It's just really a lot of discussion of exposition. But I think one thing I really like about the finale of the film is that it is kind of the most gruesome moment of it. They do not shy away from the fact, like they shy away from a lot of the other unsavory aspects, in that the movie actually acknowledges the fact that Dracula has to be stabbed to death brutally to kill him. And, that, like, I get a kick out of the idea of what a 1931 audience would think of such a thing. Harker and Van Helsing are following Renfield to the Abbey. And the Abbey, this scene here is just one of the most fantastic sets in the film. This huge staircase leading up to the Dracula's lair. And it's really a treat after, kind of the monotony of the middle portion of the film between Dracula's grand castle in Transylvania and this here. Master, here. This is one of two moments that is taken out of both releases of Dracula in when they reissued Dracula in 1935, or I believe maybe 37, when it had this successful revival. They wouldn't issue a re-release certificate because of this moment here, because Dracula breaks Renfield's neck, and you do hear a snap, and Renfield shrieking with utter horror. And adding insult to injury, you see him roll down the stairs. It's pretty fantastic. Lugosi and those hands. I consider myself an actor. I've done this play as a technical person, and just sitting backstage, I wanted to be Dracula, and it would probably be just to think of impersonating. I don't know if I'm impersonating, but just kind of paying homage to Lugosi, and just like I said before, I just so admire the physical use of his body. Those hands in particular are utterly spectacular. As an actor, I've done acting exercises where they just, talk about find that animal, and Lugosi just looks like a cat. Like there's like a slenderness, a femininity to the way he carries his hands, but it's so piercing, so like strong at the same time, and it's utterly spectacular. My favorite moment of it is when he goes after Renfield to kill him, because you know that all that force is about to break his neck. Harker, Harker. They find them, and this is a moment where they wrap everything up. And another moment that was taken out of the film is Lugosi screaming when they hammer the stake into his heart. And I'm really glad that they found it and were able to restore it, because I just think that, a film like this shouldn't be sugar-coated, because it was brave in what it was trying to do for its time. And I think that kind of ambition and just should be acknowledged, I believe. Pretty much the play ends the same way, but poor Renfield is actually allowed to live in the play, and he is released from the spell of Dracula. Van Helsing here, he's so ambitious, he grabs the stake before Harker even gives him it. One thing I never really fully understand is what level of vampire are Renfield and Mina at this point? Because Dracula is obviously switched blood with them, and Mina's under a spell, but is she human at this point? Is she a vampire? And if that is the case, then could Dracula potentially be cured of his vampirism as well, just by killing the vampire that he was under it? But that's really just me kind of trailing off there. And so the film ends happily, and David Manners gets his girl, even though I don't really believe that Helen Chandler or David Manners are very interested in each other. And Van Helsing stays behind to presumably kill Renfield. But of course, if you watch the sequel, Dracula's Daughter, it picks up immediately after this film ends, and there's even more horrors at hand. And the bells are tolling, wedding bells of all things, to end the film. I hope you enjoyed this commentary. I had a fun time doing it. It was mainly me talking about the play, which I enjoy quite a bit, and I just really think Dracula is a very special movie. It means a great deal to me, and I hope I was able to give you some new insight into it. I don't proclaim to be an expert like some people are. I do enjoy reading a lot about these films, but I hope what I was able to give was my own personal recollection, because that is what I enjoy so much about these fan commentaries and just about having dialogue about film, is that, they mean something to everyone. And if Dracula meant something to you, then I hope I was able to enhance your appreciation of it. I don't know if this will be the first of many commentaries, but I hope that it is, and that I think we can grow together, and hopefully next time there aren't so many dead areas. I appreciate you being patient with me, and I look forward to next time. Thank you.